Okay, so welcome to the power of the webinar, which is a webinar about webinars. And this is going to be all about engaging large audiences, or large virtual audiences with natural history. So it's going to have a very specific focus on that. So I'm just going to start with a little bit about me. I've got many hats. So those that know me know I'm very involved in a lot of invertebrate organizations, biological recording organizations. But in this talk, I'm going to be specifically talking about three parts of the work that I've done over the years. So I'm going to start off by talking about my work with the Field Studies Council uh, on the FSC BioLinks project, and specifically the webinars that we delivered during that period of April 2020 to May 2022. I'm then going to go on to talk about some virtual talks that I ran as a volunteer with London Natural History Society between July 2020 and December 2022. I should mention the FSC talks, Field Studies Council talks, were generally about invertebrates. BioLinks was an invertebrate focused project. With London Natural History Society, we had a much wider remit. It included botany, fungi, birds, mammals, any natural history subject was basically fair game. And I should point out the talks didn't end in December 2022. That's just when I stopped being involved in hosting and organising them, and I took a bit more of a back seat. And then finally, I'm going to talk about my work with Biological Recording Company from February 2023 to the present into the, hopefully, the distant future. I'll be specifically focusing on the entoLIVE program, but I'll mention some of the webinar programs that I've got. So there's quite a lot of webinar and virtual event experience there that I'm going to draw from. And what I'm going to try and do is tell you what not only what we achieved, that's nice to showcase, but what I've learned during this during these webinars as well. So to start off, Field Studies Council are an environmental organisation, environmental education charity. I worked on the FSC BioLinks project, which you'll hear a lot about in Dan's talk as well. And what we were traditionally doing during the BioLinks project, our remit was to educate people in in invertebrate identification and recording, and try and encourage more people to go out and make species occurrence records of these underrecorded and difficult to identify groups. And we did that traditionally in the classroom, studying ecology and ID, quite often using microscopes, and also out in the field, putting things into practice, putting our skills into practice and making actual records. So as you can see from the images there. Unfortunately, in the middle of the project, this happened. COVID-19 pandemic hit us, and that meant that everything that we were doing was no longer viable. So we had a decision to make as the project team. Do we look at alternative methods of delivering our remit, for example, through webinars, or do we furlough the whole team? The lottery gave us, who funded the project, National Lottery Heritage Fund, did give us permission to furlough. But we thought about it and we really didn't, we wanted to be innovative and look at new ways of delivering our training so that the project just didn't come to a hard stop during COVID. So we had a few things to consider. First of all, we had to make sure that we were still meeting the aims of the objectives that we'd outlined with our funders. So we're funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. We essentially have a contract with them to make sure that we're meeting grant conditions. So whatever we did needed to be in line with that, and any changes to our project needed signed off by the funder. We're also aware that the Field Studies Council, as quite a staff-heavy organisation, was going to be burning through money. So we needed to make sure that whatever we did was going to have no additional cost to the FSC, and if possible, could even generate some money to offset the money that was being spent by the organisation but not being brought back in, because most of the operations within the Field Studies Council had to cease due to COVID, with maybe the exception of the publications work. And then finally, we also needed to think about our volunteers and our trainees, our attendees, as well as our staff. We wanted to make sure that we didn't leave them to suffer during COVID with nothing from us, and we didn't want to lose connections with them, and we wanted to make sure that we were contributing positively to their well-being. So we decided to come up with webinars to try and connect with our volunteers and the people that had engaged in the project. We wanted to retain that link between us and those. We also saw an opportunity to use webinars to engage people that we maybe hadn't engaged before. So we had a very specific remit of the southeast of England and the West Midlands, but webinars give us an opportunity to go beyond those borders. And then finally, we wanted our webinars to mean something. We wanted them to contribute towards biological recording and the conservation sector. So we didn't want to just run webinars for the sake of connecting with our volunteers and engaging a wider audience. We wanted to make sure that we were encouraging people to record in their garden, or giving people opportunities to get involved with other conservation projects, etc. So we came up with a series which we initially called the FSC BioLinks virtual meetups. That then turned into 3 separate webinar series as lockdowns got extended, etc. So we had our virtual meetups, our natural history lives followed on from the virtual meetups, and we also had a series of 5 webinars called invertebrate conservation skills webinars, which were aimed more professionals and site managers to upskill them in invertebrate conservation techniques. So we went beyond our normal remit of invertebrates, because beggars can't be choosers. We had to do this, we had to do it quick. So anybody that had a project that we felt like we could help them promote, we did. We worked quite closely with the Back from the Brink collection of projects, which a lot of were not invertebrate focused. So we offered a helping hand to others as well. Our webinars look very much like you see today. They were Zoom meetings, usually about 45 minutes with a half-hour presentation and 15 minutes for questions. Here you see a talk about bumblebees, and specifically a project in the southeast of England with Lauren Kennedy. So we'd have the same format as today, a webinar presentation followed by a Q&A. And the whole thing was recorded and put on YouTube. So what did we achieve? Well, there's some pretty impressive numbers here. We did 85 virtual talks by the end of the project. By the end of, I think we wrapped up with the webinars in spring 2022. We had over 12,000 live participants. At the time that we wrote up the report for the project, which would have been October 2022, we had over 70,000 views on YouTube. I haven't been back and recounted, but that will have been upped since then, because people will continue to engage with the videos long after the project is finished. And really importantly, something I also want to share is that we made nearly £18,000 off the webinars through donations that people gave. So they didn't drain the coffers. In fact, they contributed, and they helped us find match funding for our project, which the FSC was obligated to, but suddenly was in a position where it maybe wasn't able to pay it. So really useful. On the other side, though, we did notice that the usefulness and enjoyment scores that people rated these events were lower than normal. So 4.4 out of 5 seems really high, but our in-person stuff on average scored a fair bit higher than that. It was almost perfect scores. So it's worth noting that they're not a substitute for the in-person stuff, but they can be used to complement it. So if we look at just the virtual meetups and the natural history lives, this is the number of attendees on each webinar over time. So you've got all the webinars lined up chronologically there. And the red is the virtual meetups, the green is the natural history lives. When we were doing the virtual meetups, we were averaging about 3.9, so nearly 4 webinars per month. We had an average of 133 attendees per webinar. During the natural history lives, we had less webinars per month, on average about 2.3, and we had 152 attendees per webinar. So we got more attendees per webinar over time, but we can see that it's not a straight line going up. So just to point out some things about this time frame, here we can see when COVID pandemic was taking place. The darker orange bands are when we had national lockdowns in the UK. It's probably not a coincidence that there are some spikes around the lockdowns. When people are locked at home, they're more likely to attend a webinar. But we still see some declines within that pandemic. There's a lot going on there, so it's hard to pick out exactly what the reasons for that were. But a couple of things that I've noticed. There's a period where it dipped quite a bit. And during this period, we worked with our sister team, who had a much wider remit than we did. So we went from being mainly invertebrate webinars to being a much wider range, and we saw our numbers dip. And I think that was to do with the specific audience that BioLinks had. I think we had a lot of invertebrate enthusiasts, so a lot of the people that had attended previous webinars maybe just weren't quite as interested in plants, mammals, cetaceans, which I know are mammals, etc. So that's my thinking on why we might have had that dip. It might also be to do with the fact that there was less webinars per month, so momentum wasn't quite as constant. And then we can see this huge spike at the end. And that's because when we got towards the end of the project, we realized we had money left over, and we thought, right, we're going to really put some effort into these webinars. And we spent money on marketing, particularly on Facebook marketing. And we saw big jumps in our numbers because of that. So if we look at the pattern overall, we can see that we started off relatively high, it dipped over time, and then it started picking up as we started using marketing. So what did people tell us about these webinars? How did they benefit people? So it was acknowledged that this was a new online style of delivery, and we had a lot of problems early on with tech, with people not understanding how to use Zoom, etc. But those problems have dissipated over time, and there's definitely less people that are less familiar with Zoom. People acknowledge that it replaced the normal talks and courses, but I will stress that a 45-minute webinar is no substitute for a one-day online, one-day in-person course. People found them incredibly educational. They reported that they brightened up their week. So we've got to remember that a lot of this happened at a time when people were really suffering with their mental health because of COVID, and some people with their physical health, obviously, as well. So this not only provided education, but it provided a bit of an uplift to people. And it allowed them to feel like they weren't on their own at home. It was a great way to reach lots of people. I mean, our courses in person had a cap of microscope courses 10, field courses between 15 and 20 maximum. So we were reaching much bigger numbers on the webinars. But something that we didn't intend that was amazing was it gave us access to people that could never physically attend our courses, or at least never physically attend as many of the things that we were putting out there. And that might include people that have disabilities that mean that they're not able to travel to or sit through a full day in a classroom. So it opened up our content to a wider audience. And that includes people that live further away out of the region as well. And also people that work or have family commitments. So some people might not be able to attend a full day because it doesn't work with school pickups and drop-offs, and or they work during the week, or they work during the weekend when the course is at weekend. So it just made things a lot more accessible. What did we learn? So here's my top tips from what I learned at the FSC. First of all, don't be a hero. Anybody who tries to manage a virtual event on their own, especially if it's got a decent sized audience, is asking for trouble. I tend to have a team of between 2 and 4 people, not necessarily including the host, on every webinar that I run. If you try and do everything, you'll do nothing very well. So it does require a team. Practice makes perfect. So give your speakers an opportunity to practice sharing their screen. Make sure you're not doing all that on the go, and be aware that you might need to refamiliarize yourself with Zoom settings or whatever platform you're using every time there's an update. So you need to be aware of constant updates and changes. You're the expert, so it doesn't matter how good your technical skills are in using Zoom, etc. When you are hosting a webinar to your audience, you are the expert. You need to be able to troubleshoot with them if they're having problems logging in, or if they're having problems with their sound, etc. So you might need to do a bit of research about where to link them online for help with connection issues, etc. You need to understand what might cause these issues. Oh, I've clicked out of the... There we go. Too many cooks. So the more people that you have on your webinar, the more likely it is that there's going to be tech issues. Because, I mean, first of all, it's pure maths. The more people you've got, the more chances that things will go wrong with a person. But also what we found is the more people there are, the worse the internet connection for people might be. So if you're aiming to do a webinar with a really, really big audience, sharing videos within the webinar might not work. So you need to make sure that you've got alternatives for that. So if there's a really important video that you want to share with people, I always try and get it on YouTube as well. So if it's not working for people in the webinar, they can click on the link and watch it in YouTube. Bear in mind that just because it's working well on your computer or somebody else's doesn't mean the connection is strong enough for somebody else to be able to see it well. Pick your battles. I saw during COVID so many organizations try and use lots of different fancy features, and it would just all go wrong. I like to keep it simple, and those who attend my events regularly will know that all of my events follow the same format. When I have clients who come and want to do an event with me, I will really steer them towards the format that I use. For example, I try to avoid at all costs hybrid events because you've got all the issues that can go wrong with an in-person event, all the issues that can go wrong with a virtual event. And if it goes wrong for one audience, it can impact the other audience. So it's just an accident waiting to happen. I have had hybrid events where it has been a bit of a disaster. So my advice is if you want to do something in person, make it accessible to a virtual audience, think about how you can maybe run them as two separate events, not necessarily on the same day. Or maybe record the content and make that available afterwards rather than trying to do everything at the same time. The tech should be there in theory, but I find it never really truly is. Chat versus no chat. So we got a lot of comments about the chat early on. People telling us they hated it, it was distracting. People telling us they loved it when we closed it down. People didn't like that. So it's very divisive. People were pro and con. What I try and do now is give advice about how we're going to use the chat at the beginning of a Zoom webinar and explain to people how they can make it work or disappear for them. Listen and learn. So if you're having problems and people are complaining about things or giving you constructive criticism, do take that on board and try and learn. The way I run webinars now is very different from that first webinar that me and Holly run during BioLinks. There were definite problems there that we've learned from. And this is a constant thing. So we can always make them better. And as technology changes and as the way people use technology changes, the way we deliver webinars is going to change as well. And then finally, immortalize your content. If you're going to do a webinar, it's always good to try and get permission to record it. If it's a webinar that you're charging for, you can put that behind a paywall somewhere or a password protected website. If it's a free webinar, why not make it publicly available, the video through YouTube, etc. I have to say that I get more engagement through YouTube than I do in the live events. So the live webinar is only part of the engagement. Right, okay, moving on to London Natural History Society. So I'm just going to talk briefly about this. So again, during COVID, we had to come up with a way of engaging with our members. So we came up with the LNHS, that's what I'm going to refer to London Natural History Society as from now on, the LNHS virtual talks. And they unlike with BioLinks, they covered a much wider range of natural history. So we have to be aware that with this series, the audience that we have for a talk about birds might be more different from the audience, might be fairly different from the audience that we have on a talk about ladybirds. There will be some overlap. Whereas with BioLinks, when it was invertebrate talk, we were likely to be recapturing a lot of the same audience again and again. So looking at just 2021 as an example, we can see that the LNHS virtual talks provided some really impressive achievements for the society. I mean, we had over 9,500 bookings on Eventbrite. That is something that as a society, before this happened, we wouldn't never have dreamed of. We can see that the average number of people attending is 202, so it's higher than BioLinks. And the reason for that is they were a bit more consistent in terms of spacing. So we had them every 2 weeks, and they went on longer than BioLinks as well. So they've been a permanent thing since they started. And yeah, some other really, really impressive figures. But one of the main achievements was we were really worried about our membership crashing. So LNHS membership had been on a bit of a steady decline for a long time, as is the same with a lot of natural history societies. But when we decided doing our virtual talks, we actually saw our membership fly back up. So we reversed a long-term trend, a long-term decline, which was really impressive. And one of the reasons why LNHS still continues to do the virtual talks to this day. So the patterns for the LNHS talks were a little bit different. We can see here both the bookings in blue, the attendees in green. The patterns mirror each other, and we can see that they rose and then have started to decline. So I'm going to try and see if I can figure out why that is. Well, again, these came about because of COVID. So it's no surprise during COVID, they were on the rise. So as we raised awareness of what we were doing, as our audience grew, they on average rose. In recent years, they started to decline. We believe the reason for that is possibly to do with making them less frequent. So the red period there is where we went to 1 a month rather than them more frequently. And that's not something we can change because it's run completely by volunteers and it's a lot of work. And even once per month is a lot of work. So it's likely to level off a bit now. So what lessons did we learn during the time that I was doing the LNHS virtual talks? So a large audience is not guaranteed. Just because you do these webinars doesn't mean you'll automatically get a lot of people. You need to put a lot of effort into promoting them, to sharing the details with not only your members, but publicly as well. And you need to keep momentum. So you need to have them fairly regularly in order to maintain that regular audience as well. So you need to think about regular audience and new audience in order to make sure that you've got large audiences. And webinars are a lot of work. So I don't think the society realized how much work the virtual talks team was putting into it. So we were a team of 4 volunteers that were working on it, and that included hosting it. And we always had 3 people hosting and back of house from the lessons I learned from BioLinks. But there's also getting the events on Eventbrite, there's finding the speakers, there's processing the recording, there's promoting and marketing it. So there's all these various things apart from just running the webinar. And that needs to be considered when planning a webinar program. Some people will only engage virtually. So we got, like I said, we got lots of new members, but that included people that would never engage with the society otherwise. So we had members suddenly from all over the world because they found our talk series fascinating and they wanted to contribute towards the society. So they joined, but they weren't bothered about getting our journal and they weren't bothered about coming on our field meetings because they weren't feasible. What they were really excited about was our virtual talks. Likewise, there were members of the LNHS that would normally go to our in-person stuff that never attended any of the virtual talks. And there were some people that overlapped. And planning for the future is essential. So we did this, put a lot of work into it, but the society really needed to think about how this is going to work in the long term and what is a reasonable ask of volunteers. And with paid staff, it's the same. You need to think about how you're going to maintain it in the long run. Right, that brings me on to the Biological Recording Company and the webinar series that I run, but I'm going to focus on entoLIVE. So when the BioLinks project finished and I set up the Biological Recording Company, I wanted to launch a webinar series, but I wanted the webinar series to have a really specific focus, and I wanted it to be something that I was passionate about. As an amateur naturalist who's not an academic, one of the problems that I saw was that there are barriers to using scientific outputs. So all of these research papers come out that I could potentially use as an amateur naturalist, but quite often I can't access them. And I can't access them because I don't have paid memberships to journals or the platforms that host journals. If you're part of an academic institution, you'll quite often have these, but the rest of us don't, and it's not a realistic cost for us to take on board. But there are also barriers in terms of interpretation. Sometimes the descriptions of complicated experimental methods will be way over my head, and reading an article will be quite difficult because of that. Additionally, the way that scientific articles are quite often written, they contain a lot of technical language. So I'll constantly be having to Google what things mean. And then sometimes the analysis is way, way over my head. So complicated statistics, complicated explanations of what the genetic data means. Sometimes I need that interpreted in layman's terms. So I wanted to come up with a webinar series that would focus on invertebrates, because they're my thing, and open up scientific outputs related to invertebrates for a wider audience, for wildlife gardeners, for environmental educators, for conservation professionals that don't work in academia or don't have a foot in academia, for ecological consultants, for biological recorders, for amateur naturalists, for all of us. So I came up with entoLIVE. The remit is simply guest researcher presents 1 hour webinar, 30-40 minute presentation with a Q&A. The guest speakers are invited to include heavy science, but make sure that it's explained. So they can use complicated statistics and graphs, but they need to explain it to somebody that doesn't have a PhD or even a master's in these subject matters. So we covered all invertebrates: marine, terrestrial, freshwater. You can check out, there's a few links going in the chat relating to entoLIVE and finding out more. And I wanted to do things differently. So I wanted to take everything I learned so far with webinars and really professionalize it and come up with a series that really showed the power of the webinar and what we can do with it. So first up, I wanted to make sure that we had an aim and a goal, and that there was a real point to the webinar series. So I wanted to promote invertebrate research outputs, so scientific papers, data sets, museum collections, things like that. And I wanted to engage a larger audience than I'd ever done before. I wanted to take this to the next level. So I needed a marketing budget or capacity to do marketing for that. I also wanted to think about sustainability of the program as well, make sure that it was feasible, that it could run essentially forever and even carry on when I'm no longer able to be part of it because I've passed away age 120. So I wanted it to be a permanent ongoing program, and I wanted it to be a collaborative model for maximum impact. So I didn't want entoLIVE to just be my thing. I wanted to get involved other organizations that have kudos within this area and that would have the same objectives as me in promoting invertebrate research outputs. And like I said, I wanted it to be sustainable. So it needed to generate income for financial stability. And I didn't want to rely on volunteers. I wanted the speakers to get offered a speaker fee, which they can choose to take or not take. But I wanted it to be something that was attractive to early career researchers as well, and give them a little bit of a financial boost if they give their time. And researchers should get paid for their time. I also knew that I couldn't do this on my own. And like I said, don't be a hero. So I needed webinar assistants as well. So I wanted to make sure I had funds to pay them for their time as well. And then finally, I wanted to make sure that it produced valuable engagement outputs, which means that I need to measure and look at the impact it's having. So that needs to be demonstrable. So as well as the webinars, we wanted YouTube videos. I wanted to take that to the next level and have blogs with the Q&A transcribed and all the useful links. So there was a resource that outlasted the webinar, and I wanted to demonstrate that impact. So I came up with a model based on collaboration. I had two funders / partners initially, British Entomological and Natural History Society, and I got a Goodman Award from the Royal Entomological Society to do season 1, the first 20 webinars in 2023. Then the Field Studies Council Environment Job joined the entoLIVE family and helped fund it as well. And the Chalk and Chase Landscape Partnership had a project called Nurturing Nature, and they funded some specific webinars that helped them achieve their goals. Funders weren't going to fund it forever, so some funders dropped out. Amateur Entomologists Society joined this year in 2024, but NBN Trust, Bug Life, Field Studies Council remain involved in a non-financially supporting capacity by promoting the webinars to their audiences. So what have we achieved? Loads of stuff. I mean, the numbers are incredible. Over 30,000 bookings, over 8,000 live attendees, over 34,000 YouTube views, over 14,000 blog views. And some of the specific statistics, over 1,100 people booked on one webinar. And for some reason, the Leech video has gone absolutely crazy, and it's killed all of the competition. So there's still stuff in there. I don't understand why some do better than others. And what's been really interesting is the webinars that have booked the best and been the best attended haven't necessarily produced the most watched or most watched videos or the most read blogs. So what's the pattern like? Well, in terms of bookings, it's a really nice trend. I'm really happy. And that is matched by the attendance, although the attendance is a bit more jittery. And that's probably to do with time of year and particularly weather. But we can see that the average number of attendees starts off as 136 during season 1 in 2023. Season 2 in the second half of 2023 went up to 183, and we're currently in season 3, which is all of 2024. Each season's 20 webinars, and we're up to 217. So there's a nice steady incline. So I'm really pleased that all the efforts that we're putting in are paying off. What are the impacts? Well, it's doing what we wanted it to do. It's bringing academic invertebrate research to amateurs. It's presenting highly specialized knowledge, and it's doing that in a way that people can understand. There's also no such thing as niche. People are really interested, and we're getting good numbers on things that others might think you would never get good numbers on. So people have commented that they introduce them to topics that they would never have even heard of. So these are not things that they would have looked for. For example, the fly migration webinar got loads of positive feedback. And fly migration is probably something that a lot of us are not looking up all the time on Google. Groundbreaking access. So we got a lot of kudos for what we did. It's been recognized that it's really well advertised and widely known. So it's pushing it out there all the time, spending a lot of time promoting it, that is getting us those good numbers. And finally, we are getting evidence back that it is having the impact that we wanted. It's useful to be able to access the films later via YouTube, and people have been able to use it in voluntary conservation roles and for blog posts and all sorts of other things. So when we did a survey, people have showed us that yes, most of the people that responded to the survey, because it went out to people that were booked on the survey, are engaging via Zoom. But there are a fair proportion that are watching it on YouTube, and bear in mind that this survey wouldn't capture people that only watch it on YouTube but never booked, so that are following us on YouTube and the blogs as well. So very few people are booking and not engaging at all. When we ask people how their engagement has impacted them with entoLIVE, we can see that people obviously learn about invertebrates and natural history, blah, blah, blah. But we've got 20, around 25%, around a quarter, have looked up invertebrate research outputs following an entoLIVE webinar. Around a third have used the knowledge gained from entoLIVE in their voluntary or paid work. And over a third have been motivated to take part in invertebrate research. So we're seeing the people reporting the real impact from the webinars, and that goes beyond just your traditional webinar attendee. Our speakers telling us that they found it really useful and it helps them tick boxes with engaging people with their research and helps get their research out there. So we're providing a service for them as well. And we've had organizations like record centers, local environmental record centers, telling us that they find it as a fantastic resource for sharing with their event staff, their staff and volunteers, and it enables them to share stuff that they wouldn't be able to do themselves otherwise. So what are the lessons we've learned? Collaboration can lead to wonderful things. So the entoLIVE family is probably the thing that I'm most proud of with the webinar program. It feeds speakers into the program. It enables these organizations to engage with audiences that they might not otherwise have the ability to do. And it really fosters a friendly, inviting, collaborative way of working. There's no such thing as niche in nature. I really wanted to hone in on something that people might think is quite specialist. And we've shown that we can get bigger numbers than other people on working on much less niche things. So if it's really niche, chances are other people aren't doing it. So there's an even bigger market for it. People are really curious about things they've never heard of. Social media is ever changing. So I tried using Facebook advertising like I'd done with the FSC and it didn't work. So we need to be aware of what social media platforms are coming up, how to spend money in them or how to organically promote stuff. You can't always stick to what you've always done because new audiences that are coming through use social media in different ways. And there's no reason not to pay naturalists. If you're coming up with a webinar series, the onus is on you to make sure that you're doing it in a way where you can pay your naturalists. If you're doing it for free, stick a donate button on there or GoFundMe so that there's a way of getting money to your naturalists. We should not be delivering this kind of thing and not expecting to pay people for their skills. And finally, bees are rock stars. So the bee stuff always goes crazy. Outside of invertebrates, fungi always goes crazy. So yeah, make sure you've got a mix of niche and popular stuff in your webinar series. So what has this led to? Well, I'm pleased to say that I've got a funding bid in with the British Ecological Society for Marine Live, which will be a sister series to entoLIVE and focus on marine biology research. We had a pilot seahorses webinar earlier this month, which went down really well. I've been experimenting with charging methods for webinar-based events like my virtual symposiums. So these are the ones I've got coming up. But the entoLIVE audience feeds into these as well. So building that audience through a free webinar program has helped me draw in an audience for my core profit-making stuff that funds the business. Another sister series is entoLearn, where we have training webinars rather than engagement with research webinars. I've got loads of them coming up. One taking place tomorrow on freshwater leeches. Still loads of space. If anyone wants to book, please do. And then I've got one aimed at ecologists and conservation professionals, skills for ecology. Again, I'm experimenting with different subjects to see what works and what doesn't. And then finally, one of the best things about doing entoLIVE has been that it has opened up opportunities for collaboration with other organizations. So I now have some clients that want to showcase some of their products, services, and work, and I can work with them and bring my audience to them. So I can generate funds from them to do some of the other fantastic stuff that the Biological Recording Company does for free. And like, for example, I can host the Earthworm Society AGM and help them get numbers that they would never have dreamed of. Same working with London Natural History Society. So all the webinars that you see there are free. So they're available to anybody to book for free. And part of the reason why they're free is because of the work that I've done in other webinar programs that has led to either me being able to justify doing them for free, or me finding a client that can pay me to run the webinar because of the audiences that I've generated. So